Do you really believe the mafia bosses of the past are gone? Do you honestly think that when a man like Tommy Lucchese died in 1967, his empire just crumbled into dust, leaving behind nothing but yellowing headlines and courtroom transcripts? Or do you ever wonder, quietly, late at night, if the bones of his empire are still alive beneath the city you walk through every day? Because here's the darker possibility. What if Lucchese didn't just build a family? What if he built something bigger? Something that outlived him? A shadow government woven into unions, businesses, politics, even skyscrapers? What if the world you think is yours, the jacket on your back, the road under your feet, the job you depend on, is still haunted by a man who has been dead for more than half a century? That's the question that makes Lucchese terrifying. He was not the loudest mob boss, not the most violent. He wasn't the one who painted alleys with bodies. No. His weapon was quieter, sharper, harder to trace. He was the man who mastered the art of silence. And silence is the most dangerous weapon of all. Because think about it. Lucky Luciano, Vito Genovese, Carlo Gambino. These names drew headlines, indictments, photographs splashed across every front page. But Tommy Lucchese, he slipped through history, almost untouched. One arrest at 21. Never another. No prison sentences. No public executions. No flashy downfall. Instead, he built an empire so invisible that even the FBI could only glimpse the edges. And maybe that's why his story doesn't just read like crime. It reads like something darker, something speculative, almost supernatural. How does a man surrounded by killers, betrayals, and federal investigations live long enough to die in his own bed? How does a boss escape the blood-soaked curse of the mafia when all the others ended in gunfire or chains? Was it luck? Or did Lucchese discover a truth no one else dared touch? That real power doesn't come from fear alone. It comes from invisibility, from learning how to vanish inside the very system that hunts you. So tonight, you're not just going to hear about a gangster. You're going to hear about a phantom, a man whose fingers, 3 of them, to be exact, still seem to curl around the throat of New York, long after his coffin was sealed. And as you sink deeper into the story, ask yourself this: what's scarier, the gangsters who fire guns in alleys, or the one who never had to? And before we dive into it, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Because some stories feel different, depending on the hour. Chapter 1. The Tailor's Son. They called him Gaetano, once, a name that sounded like an echo from the cobbled streets of Palermo, Sicily. But in America, names were fragile things, easily bent, softened, Americanized to fit the new soil. So Gaetano Lucchese became Thomas, Tommy, and in time, the world would know him as Tommy Brown, or more ominously still, Three-Finger Brown. After a childhood accident mangled his right hand and left him with only 3 working digits. Born in 1899, he came into a world already boiling with migration and struggle. His parents fled the poverty of Sicily, only to find themselves in the concrete labyrinth of East Harlem, a place where poverty had simply changed its accent. Tenements stacked on top of each other, alleys choked with garbage, children learning early that fists and lies could get them further than prayers. Tommy was not tall, not imposing, not the sort of man one would imagine ruling a kingdom of killers. But like all shadows, his power was not in size, but in silence. He studied men, their weaknesses, their hunger. He listened more than he spoke, and when he did, it was with the precision of a tailor cutting cloth, every word measured, every promise stitched tightly into the memory of the listener. From the very beginning, Tommy understood something that many of his contemporaries missed. Violence was useful, but charm was indispensable. As a boy, he ran errands for street gangs, watched older boys bleed in fights, but he never let rage be his language. Instead, he carried himself with a calm that unsettled men twice his age. He knew how to disarm a room without raising his voice. By his teens, while others were still playing the brash tough guy act, Lucchese had already entered the peripheries of what would later crystallize into the American Mafia. He became an apprentice in crime, learning the trade of bootlegging and numbers running during the Prohibition era. This was no small thing. Prohibition was the gold rush of the underworld, turning street urchins into millionaires overnight. But where others rushed in like wolves tearing at a carcass, Tommy moved with caution, always aligning himself with the right men at the right time. He knew instinctively that power was not won by fists alone. It was built on alliances, whispers, and the ability to make other men feel that their survival depended on you. What makes Tommy Lucchese's rise terrifying in hindsight is not just the criminality of it, but the cold patience. In 1920, at just 21 years old, he was arrested for auto theft. When he appeared before the judge, he smiled politely, pled guilty, and served his time quietly. That conviction was his first and only. Unlike his peers, who racked up charges like badges of honor, Lucchese wore silence as his shield. He understood that real bosses don't attract the gaze of the law. They operate in the negative space, letting louder men take the bullets and headlines. By the time Prohibition was roaring, he had attached himself to Charles "Lucky" Luciano, a man with vision, brutality, and ambition to match. Together, they were part of the new breed of gangsters who rejected the old Sicilian codes of loyalty to village and blood. Instead, they dreamed of something colder, more efficient, a national syndicate of crime, stripped of sentiment and built for profit. And here lies the haunting detail about Tommy Lucchese. While others like Luciano, Genovese, or Anastasia left trails of blood and fear that even newspapers could not ignore, Tommy remained quiet, almost invisible. He rose like smoke, curling into the upper tiers of the underworld, until no one could remember when he stopped being a soldier and became a power in his own right. He earned his nickname, Three-Finger Brown, not just for his mangled hand, but because he could grasp the world with fewer fingers than most men needed. He knew how to slip into alliances, how to survive purges, how to whisper just enough into a boss's ear to appear indispensable. By the 1930s, while the five families were being carved from the flesh of old-world traditions, Tommy Lucchese stood as one of the architects, a man whose silence was far more dangerous than another's screams. What makes his story unsettling is not simply the fact of his rise, but the way he seemed to bend the laws of probability. In an era when bosses were gunned down in barber chairs, blown apart in streets, or dragged to court in chains, Tommy avoided the bullet, the indictment, the cell. He moved in shadows so carefully that it felt almost supernatural. Some whispered that he was untouchable, that he carried a charm or a curse, depending on which side you were on. But perhaps it was simpler and darker still. He understood the single rule that governed the underworld. Not that loyalty matters, not that violence rules, but that fear and favor, carefully balanced, can bind men tighter than any oath of blood. And Lucchese mastered both. Chapter 2. The Architecture of Quiet Power. To understand Tommy Lucchese is to understand the anatomy of subtlety in a world built on brutality. He was not Albert Anastasia, the Mad Hatter, who let his rage decorate alleys with corpses. He was not Vito Genovese, driven by ego to challenge even the throne of Luciano himself. He was not even Lucky, whose daring restructured the Mafia like a corporation and drew the gaze of every lawman in America. No, Lucchese was the ghost in the boardroom, the quiet architect who knew that true power was not in the swing of a gun, but in the invisible lines of influence that stretched across industries, unions, and politics. While others drenched their names in blood, Tommy built a criminal empire that wore a mask of legitimacy so convincing that even senators and governors found themselves unwittingly serving him. By the 1940s, Lucchese controlled more than a crime family. He controlled entire sectors of the city's lifeblood: garment unions, trucking, construction, even air freight. These were not glamorous rackets, not the flashy robberies or casino operations that made headlines. They were arteries of commerce, and by placing himself at the junctions of those arteries, Lucchese made himself the silent heart of New York's economy. Consider this: By some estimates, his influence over the garment industry unions meant that nearly 70% of clothing entering the city bore his hidden tax. Trucking companies could not move goods without paying his men. Politicians could not campaign without dipping into funds that were in some way filtered through his unions. He had woven himself into the very fabric of the city. And the terrifying part? Most people never even knew his name. To the average New Yorker, the Mafia was the gunfire in Little Italy or the bloody purges of Brooklyn. But Lucchese was not there. He was in the quiet offices, behind closed doors, smiling with 3 fingers folded over ledgers that decided which businesses thrived and which went bankrupt overnight. What is haunting is the contrast between his demeanor and his reach. Associates described him as almost paternal, soft-spoken, polite, even kind. He offered advice to younger mobsters, helped their families when money was tight, even carried himself with the gentle warmth of a neighborhood uncle. And yet, beneath that warmth, lay something reptilian. The warmth was calculated, designed to disarm, to make loyalty feel natural rather than enforced. And for those who mistook it as weakness, the correction was brutal. Men who crossed Lucchese did not receive fiery vendettas or public executions. They simply vanished, their names erased as efficiently as a chalk mark from a blackboard. The message was not screamed in the streets, it was whispered in the silence that followed. In that way, Lucchese weaponized fear far more effectively than the loudest of killers. Speculation swirls even today about just how far his influence extended. Some historians suggest that his hand touched politics at the highest level, that governors, even presidents, brushed shoulders with men whose campaigns were oiled by union money flowing quietly from Lucchese's coffers. Others claim that during World War II, when the U.S. Navy sought mafia assistance in securing New York's docks from German sabotage, Lucchese was one of the silent beneficiaries of that arrangement, proving that in times of national crisis, even the government would feed the wolves if it meant survival. Whether these stories are exaggerations or truths hidden beneath classified files, they carry a logic that feels uncomfortably real, because Lucchese's power was not in the visible crimes, but in the way he blurred the line between the criminal and the legitimate, until the two were indistinguishable. And here is where the fear creeps in. Tommy Lucchese did not simply build a criminal empire. He built a legacy that outlived him. When he died in 1967, unlike so many of his contemporaries, it was not in a hail of bullets or the loneliness of a prison cell. He died of natural causes, a boss whose empire remained intact, whose successors inherited a machine so well-oiled it carried on long after his breath stopped. To this day, the Lucchese crime family bears his name, a testament not just to his power, but to his design. Few gangsters die peacefully. Fewer still die with their empire unbroken. And perhaps that is the most chilling legacy of all, that Tommy Lucchese may have been the rarest of monsters, the one who learned how to survive the game by bending it quietly to his will. Chapter 3. The Invisible Hand. There is something terrifying about a man whose crimes leave no trace, no echo, no headlines, only silence. In the case of Tommy Lucchese, his power became so deeply rooted in the hidden machinery of New York that some argued he didn't just control rackets, he controlled fate. The man rarely raised his voice, yet entire industries bent at the sound of it. When you trace back through the archives of the 1950s and 60s, the fingerprints of Lucchese appear not on bloody alleyways, but on contracts, union charters, political donations, even city budgets. By some estimates, his reach into the garment industry and trucking alone pumped millions of dollars annually into the family's coffers, money that passed invisibly through the pockets of working men and women who never realized their weekly wages were taxed by a phantom. Economists have argued that at its height, Lucchese's quiet taxation system skimmed so much money from legitimate commerce that it could have rivaled the GDP of small nations. And yet, where was the trail? It is as though Lucchese's family fed on shadows, leaving only whispers in the places where they fed. The stories from insiders are even more unsettling. It is said that when business leaders or politicians sat down with Lucchese, they walked away believing they had made a deal with a benevolent patron. He was the smiling godfather, nodding with sympathy, offering assurances, but beneath the warmth was a trap. Every handshake was a chain, every favor a hook. A politician might take union money for his campaign, but once in office, his votes belonged to Lucchese. A businessman might accept help, smoothing out labor disputes, but once the union was quiet, the company paid tribute indefinitely. And the most chilling part? Many of them never realized they had been captured until it was too late. By then, refusing Lucchese's friendship meant bankruptcy at best, or disappearance at worst. A garment factory could suddenly find its trucks hijacked, its workers striking, its suppliers vanishing. A politician could wake up to newspapers filled with scandals. Their career gutted overnight. It was as though Lucchese could tug at invisible strings, orchestrating outcomes like a puppeteer, and no one could prove his hand was even on the stage. Speculation goes deeper still. Some researchers believe that Lucchese's influence during the 1950s extended into the very infrastructure of New York subways, airports, and skyscrapers, rising on foundations that quietly carried his tax. In construction, every ton of concrete, every steel beam, every truckload of gravel was a vein through which money flowed back to him. There are whispers that even Madison Square Garden, the great cathedral of sports and entertainment, was built with union labor under his shadow. If true, then it means that Lucchese did not simply skim from the city, he embedded himself in its bones. That is a frightening thought, because it suggests that even today, walking through Manhattan is like walking through a mausoleum of his power, a city of stone and steel, silently bearing his fingerprints. And then there are the darker rumors, the ones that make historians pause, unsure whether they are reading crime reports or ghost stories. Some claim Lucchese had a private network of safe houses, row homes in Queens, apartments in Brooklyn, basements in the Bronx, where men who had crossed him were taken and erased. Not shot in alleys, not dumped in rivers, but vanished so completely that their names became only rumors. FBI files from the era list dozens of men missing, presumed dead. Their last known connection, a brush with Lucchese's family. It was as if his empire not only stole money, but swallowed men whole. The absence itself became the warning. And that is more frightening than blood on sidewalks, because silence can outlive memory. But here is where the myth sharpens into something uncanny. Lucchese's ability to die in peace. No prison, no gunman, no betrayal, just a hospital bed in 1967, his empire intact. Was it luck? Or was it the mark of a man who had learned to master death itself? For a gangster to escape the cycle of murder and retribution is almost unnatural. Some whisper he cut deals with enemies, others that he was shielded by politicians who owed him too much to ever let him fall. And there are darker whispers still, that Lucchese's disappearances of rivals were not just acts of violence, but ritual silences, sacrifices that bought him time, longevity, protection from the chaos that consumed all the other bosses of his era. He built an empire of shadows, and somehow found a way to live in the light. That, perhaps, is the most unsettling trick of all. Chapter 4. The City of Shadows. Even after his death in 1967, Tommy Lucchese's ghost has never really left New York. His name still hovers in courtrooms, in union halls, in whispered recollections of old men who once worked the docks or the garment factories. The family that bears his name lives on, decades after his last breath, and that is a rarity in the underworld. Most mafia families fractured under pressure, torn apart by greed, betrayals, or federal indictments. But the Lucchese family endured, as though Tommy's quiet hand still directed from beyond the grave. Historians ask why. Was his system so perfect that it outlasted him? Or was there something deeper, something almost supernatural in the way his legacy embedded itself in the city? To this day, conspiracy theorists argue that the Lucchese family was never just another mafia crew. It was a blueprint for invisible control. Consider this. The Genovese family produced loud, infamous bosses who ended up shot or jailed. The Gambinos birthed John Gotti, the Teflon Don, who basked in the spotlight only to rot in prison. But the Luccheses? Their leaders slipped into place like shadows, rarely famous, rarely flamboyant. That design, quiet, faceless, yet enduring, was pure Tommy. He understood that empires are not built on noise but on silence. The scariest monsters, after all, are the ones you cannot see. The mythology only deepens when you explore the stories that still haunt neighborhoods tied to his name. Construction workers in Manhattan whisper that during the building of high-rises in the 1950s and 60s, bodies were entombed in the foundations, men who had crossed Lucchese or outlived their usefulness. Whether true or not, the urban legends persist, that New York's skyline itself is haunted by the bones of Lucchese's enemies. There are union halls where old-timers claim you can still feel his presence. Not as a ghost in the supernatural sense, but as a lingering weight, the memory of fear that once governed the room. Some even say politicians today still rely on networks that trace their lineage back to Lucchese's empire, washed clean of its criminal origins, but carrying the same machinery of influence. If that's true, then Lucchese's not just history, he's still here, in the wires of the city, in the contracts, in the systems we mistake for ordinary bureaucracy. And then there is the most chilling speculation of all, the idea that Lucchese's peaceful death was not an end, but a handoff. That before he died, he seeded his empire with structures so resilient they could survive any storm. Some researchers believe he groomed successors, not just in the mafia, but in politics, in business, in labor, creating a web of loyalty that transcended organized crime. If correct, that would mean Lucchese's family was not merely one of the 5 families. It was something larger, a design for a hidden government, one that ruled not through guns, but through silence. And perhaps that is why the Lucchese family, to this day, remains less famous than others. Fame was never the goal. Survival was. So here is the chilling truth to take with you into the night. Tommy Lucchese may have been the rarest kind of gangster, not the warrior, not the schemer, but the architect of shadows. He built a city within the city, a second New York that most people never saw, and in doing so, he became almost mythic. He showed that the scariest power is not the one that leaves blood on the pavement, but the one that shapes your life without you ever knowing it. The scariest mob boss, perhaps, is not the one who kills you, but the one who lives in your silence long after he's gone. Chapter 5. The Whispering Legacy. There's a strange silence that clings to Tommy Lucchese's name, even today. Not the silence of forgetting, because the FBI files, the court transcripts, the union records still exist, but the silence of something unfinished, something hidden beneath the surface that no one has dared fully uncover. When you look back at the decades after his death in 1967, you notice something unsettling. While the other mafia families became household names, their bosses splashed across newspapers in trials and photographs, the Lucchese family remained oddly muted, not absent, not broken, but quieter, more elusive. And that quiet feels deliberate, like the lingering echo of Lucchese's own strategy. It's as if he taught his successors the ultimate lesson. Power survives in shadows, not in lights. But then come the whispers, stories that bleed from rumor into urban legend. Retired detectives tell tales of construction crews finding human remains beneath buildings that went up in Lucchese-controlled contracts, a ribcage beneath a foundation, a skull entombed in concrete, dismissed publicly as coincidence, but whispered privately as the true cost of crossing the wrong men. Old-timers in East Harlem claim that some businesses still carry ghost taxes, payments to faceless entities no one names, money that vanishes into shell companies with roots so deep they may trace back to Lucchese's original web. And there's a theory, whispered among historians of organized crime, that some of the missing millions from post-war rackets were never spent at all, but laundered so perfectly they still circulate in the bloodstream of modern corporations. That means every dollar you spend on certain clothes, certain goods, might be carrying the fingerprints of Lucchese himself. Not a ghost story, not superstition, but a chilling reminder that some legacies do not fade, they metastasize. Even the FBI's records seem haunted by him. Entire files remain sealed, even decades later, citing national security and sensitive sources. Why national security? For a crime boss? Some speculate it links back to the Mafia's wartime deals with the U.S. Navy, where dock security was traded for leniency. Others suggest it was because Lucchese's reach into politics was so deep that exposing it would have damaged reputations still untouchable. Whatever the truth, it leaves a hole in the narrative, a silence that feels alive. And it is in that silence where the myths take root. That Lucchese's deals didn't just build fortunes, but curses. That the unions he once controlled still feel his ghost in their bylaws. That the city itself, its steel, its stone, its very rhythm, still hums faintly with the influence of a man who has been dead for over half a century. Here is where the story turns. From crime into something more spectral. Because when you walk the streets of New York, the streets Lucchese once ruled invisibly, you can still sense it, not in the neon signs or the chaos of traffic, but in the spaces between, the quiet glances exchanged in boardrooms, the unspoken rules in industries that should be free, but somehow always feel controlled. It's as though Lucchese designed not just a crime family, but a ghost city overlaid on the real one, a hidden map of influence and silence that continues to outlive flesh and bone. And perhaps that is the scariest legacy of all. The idea that power doesn't die when the man does. It lingers. It adapts. It becomes part of the air you breathe, the concrete you walk upon, the very silence of the night around you. So tonight, as you let these words drift toward the edges of sleep, remember the tale of Tommy Lucchese, not the loud, bloody story of shootouts and betrayals, but the quieter, heavier one. The story of a man who discovered that shadows are stronger than bullets, that fear whispers louder than gunfire, that silence, once woven deeply enough into a city, can outlast death itself. Lucchese's empire was not just a family, not just a racket, but a kind of architecture of control, a framework that still bends the city in ways most will never see. But for you, here, now, the story ends in stillness. The ghosts of the past belong to another world, a darker one. Tonight, you are safe from it. The shadows stay outside your window, and the silence in your room is yours alone, not his. So close your eyes. Let the weight of the city, of its secrets and fears, drift away. You are no longer walking through the streets where Lucchese's shadow falls. You are lying in your own quiet space, beyond the reach of his whispers. And as the night carries you deeper into rest, let the story fade into nothing but a dream.